My name is Jasmine, and for most of my life, I was the shadow that everyone in my family mocked, the one they dismissed as a lost cause. They whispered behind my back and laughed in my face. I was the failure, the black sheep, the one who couldn't handle real life. My cousins became doctors, lawyers, accountants, and business owners. My aunts and uncles bragged at family dinners about how their children were thriving, building futures that would make the family proud. And then there was me, the one they said dropped out of college, the one they claimed was addicted to drugs, the one they warned their own children not to become. I let them believe it. In fact, I encouraged it. Every insult, every whisper, every lie they spread about me became a shield. If they thought I was weak, if they thought I was useless, then they would never suspect that I was watching them, that I was listening, that I was taking notes on every word, every shady deal, every unexplained dollar, and every life that disappeared after crossing them. My family was not just dysfunctional, they were dangerous. From the outside, they looked like a proud immigrant, family who built themselves up from nothing. They ran small businesses, invested in real estate, and seemed to have their hands in every corner of the community. They donated to churches, hosted charity galas, and played the part of respectable leaders. But underneath the polished image, they were something far darker. Extortion, smuggling, racketeering, trafficking. These weren't just rumors. They were the truth. And I had grown up in the middle of it. As a child, I didn't fully understand. I only knew that certain doors were locked. Certain conversations ended when I walked into a room, and certain people disappeared without explanation. When I was 15, I asked my uncle why one of his business partners never came around. Anymore. He laughed and said I asked too many questions. That was the day I realized curiosity in my family could be deadly. So I learned to keep my mouth shut. But my eyes stayed open. My memory stayed sharp. And my anger grew silently, hidden behind the mask of the failure they believed me to be. When I was 18, I left home under the guise of going to college. They assumed I flunked out because I couldn't handle it. The truth was, I had enlisted in something far more important. I was recruited, trained, and sworn in as a deputy U.S. Marshal. And from that day forward, my life was dedicated to one mission: to dismantle the empire my family had built on blood. The irony was almost poetic. They mocked me as a dropout while I spent 2 decades chasing fugitives, protecting witnesses, and learning the ins and outs of federal investigations. Every raid I participated in, every criminal I tracked down, every life I helped protect, it all sharpened me for the day I would finally turn my sights on the people who once tucked me into bed and kissed me goodnight. I became the thing they feared most, someone who could not be bought, silenced, or intimidated. But that day was still far off. In the meantime, I let their lies spread. I stayed away from family gatherings, allowing the rumors to fester until even distant relatives believed I was a burned-out addict with nothing to show for her life. My cousins pitied me. My aunts looked down on me. My uncles sneered when my name came up. And that was exactly what I wanted, because behind the scenes, I was building a case that would take years of patience, sacrifice, and secrecy. It started small: financial records, bank accounts that didn't add up, shell companies that moved money in and out without explanation. Then came the testimonies, people who had been too afraid to speak until I promised them protection. I learned to live in 2 worlds at once: the world of failure my family believed I occupied, and the world of relentless pursuit that defined my career. I knew what they were capable of. I knew the way my uncle's smile hid a predator's instinct, the way my aunt's charity events laundered dirty money, the way my cousins used their legitimate businesses as fronts. I knew, because I had once been groomed to take part in it. When I was younger, they dangled the life of wealth and power in front of me. But I had seen too much of the destruction it caused: the families torn apart, the addictions fueled, the innocent lives buried. I wanted nothing to do with it. And for that, they branded me a disgrace. In their arrogance, they never suspected me. They never imagined that the failure they mocked was the very person planting the seeds of their downfall. For years, I gathered evidence in silence, piecing together a puzzle that would eventually stretch across states and agencies. I watched People I loved commit crimes so cold that it made my stomach turn. I wanted to scream. I wanted to confront them. But I held it in, knowing that the time wasn't right. Revenge was best served cold, and mine needed to be frozen solid. The whispers followed me everywhere. At weddings, funerals, reunions, always the same pitying glances, the same cruel laughter. She couldn't handle college. She wasted her life. She's an embarrassment. They never realized how much their contempt fueled me. Every insult was gasoline on the fire that kept me going. And then, after 23 years of waiting, preparing, and building, the day finally came. The federal indictment was unsealed. My family's empire was exposed for what it truly was: a criminal network responsible for decades of violence and corruption. The courtroom was packed the day of the trial. My relatives sat in their tailored suits, their expensive jewelry flashing under the lights, their faces arranged in masks of arrogance. They still believed they were untouchable. Then the prosecutor stood up and announced the witness who would deliver the testimony that could shatter everything. And when my name was called, the entire room froze. The family dropout. The addict. The disgrace. I rose from my seat, not as the failure they had painted me to be, but as the U.S. Marshal who had spent half her life dismantling the very empire they built. It was my turn to speak. The courtroom air was thick with silence when I rose from my seat. I could feel every pair of eyes drilling into me, a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and anger. My family, sitting only a few feet away, stared at me as though I were a ghost, risen from the grave. For years, they had told themselves that I was nothing, a dropout, a junkie, a stain on their otherwise pristine image. And yet, here I was, not in the defendant's chair, but walking to the witness stand under the title of Deputy U.S. Marshal. The prosecutor's voice was calm, but there was steel in it as he introduced me. 23 years of service, a decorated career, fugitive recovery, witness protection, task force investigations, and then finally the words that made my relatives' faces twitch with panic. I was the lead investigator in the federal case against them. The jury leaned forward. The reporters scribbled furiously. The cameras in the back captured every second of their downfall. And I, the supposed dropout, was the one bringing it all crashing down. Taking the oath felt like the final act in a play I had been rehearsing for half my life. My hand on the Bible, my voice steady, my heart pounding not with fear but with justice. For so long I had been silent, burying every instinct to confront them, waiting for this very moment. Now, the silence was over. I began at the beginning. I told the court what I had seen as a child: the locked doors, the hushed conversations, the people who disappeared without reason. I explained how, as I grew older, the picture became clearer. The businesses were fronts, the charity events were cover. The family I was supposed to love and trust was nothing more than a syndicate masquerading as respectable citizens. Their lawyers tried to object, but I was ready. Every claim I made was backed by evidence, every accusation supported by documents, recordings, and testimony from others who had once been trapped in their web. I watched the confidence drain from my uncle's face as the financial records were projected on the screen, showing money laundering through his restaurants. I saw my aunt shift uncomfortably when her so-called foundation was revealed as a laundering funnel for smuggling profits. My cousin's smugness faltered as witnesses stepped forward, testifying about threats, bribes, and crimes committed under their orders. But it wasn't just facts and figures that mattered. It was the truth I carried inside me. The memories of victims who never had a voice. The mothers who buried their sons because of the drugs funneled through my family's networks. The small business owners destroyed by extortion. The families ripped apart by violence. I had spoken with them, looked them in the eyes, and promised them that justice would come. And now I was delivering on that promise. As I spoke, I remembered every insult my family had ever thrown at me. Every time they told me I was weak. Every time they said I would never amount to anything. Every time they sneered that I wasn't tough enough to survive in their world. The irony was sharp. I hadn't just survived. I had outlasted them all. The longer I testified, the more cracks began to show. My relatives whispered furiously with their lawyers, their arrogance slipping into panic. They weren't used to being exposed. They weren't used to someone standing up to them. In their minds, they had always been untouchable. But in that courtroom, stripped of their wealth, their connections, and their carefully crafted image, they were just criminals facing the consequences of their own greed. I kept my tone calm, professional, deliberate. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. I wasn't here to scream at them, to demand apologies, or to seek personal satisfaction. My revenge was larger than that. It was measured in justice served, in lives protected, in the dismantling of an empire that had thrived on suffering. It was about becoming everything they said I could never be, and using that strength to strike at the very foundation of their power. There was a moment, halfway through my testimony, when I locked eyes with my uncle, the one who had once told me I asked too many questions, the one who had laughed at me as a naive girl. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight, his fists clenched on the table. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Fear of me. Fear of the truth I carried. Fear of the consequences he could no longer escape. It was intoxicating. But I stayed composed. My training demanded it. Years in the Marshals had taught me control, discipline, patience. I wasn't there for personal glory. I was there to finish what I had started the day I left home at 18, the day I chose a different path. The hours stretched on. Piece by piece, I laid out the case. The jury listened intently, their faces hardening as the evidence piled higher. My family shifted uncomfortably. Their once proud heads bowed under the weight of exposure. By the time I stepped down from the stand, I knew the damage was irreversible. They could deny, they could deflect, they could even attempt to smear me further, but the truth was out. Their empire was collapsing, not because of some rival gang or federal raid, but because of the daughter, niece, and cousin they had cast aside as worthless. The prosecutor thanked me quietly as I returned to my seat. The trial was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. The whispers in the courtroom weren't about my supposed failures anymore. They were about the staggering betrayal I had just revealed. The betrayal of a family by one of its own, and the betrayal of me by those who had underestimated me. And yet, deep inside, I knew the trial was only the surface. The courtroom was where their legal reckoning began. But my journey had started long before. I had lived a double life for decades, balancing the facade of failure with the reality of duty. And the story of how I got here, the sacrifices, the dangers, the moments I almost broke, that story still needed to be told. Because the greatest revenge wasn't just standing in that courtroom, it was surviving everything that led up to it. When I stepped down from the witness stand, the jury and the public only saw the polished surface, the trained Marshal, the professional who stood unshaken in the face of her own family. But what they didn't see, what most would never understand, was the road that led me there. A road paved with sacrifice, loneliness, and the burden of carrying a secret so heavy it nearly crushed me. It began when I was 18. While my family believed I was drifting aimlessly after high school, pretending to attend college classes I would later drop out of, I was instead walking through the doors of the United States Marshal Service Training Academy. I still remember the first morning, the sting of cold air in my lungs, the burn in my muscles as we were pushed past breaking points, the voice in my head repeating the insults I had grown up with. "You're too weak. You'll never make it. You're nothing." Those words became my fuel. Every push-up, every mile run, every drill was a chance to prove them wrong. The training was brutal. Many didn't make it through. But I had already been hardened by years of ridicule and neglect. Pain wasn't new to me. Endurance wasn't foreign. Where others broke under the pressure, I clenched my teeth and pushed harder. Every obstacle conquered was a silent act of defiance against the family who believed I couldn't survive without them. By the time I graduated, badge in hand, I wasn't just trained. I was reborn. The first years on the job were relentless. I chased fugitives across state lines, escorted high-risk prisoners, and guarded witnesses whose lives hung in the balance. The work was dangerous, the hours long, and the risks constant. But for the first time in my life, I felt purpose. Every fugitive captured, every victim protected, was a reminder that I wasn't the failure they claimed I was. I was becoming the kind of person my family despised: honest, disciplined, incorruptible. And yet, even as I built my career, I never forgot the shadow I had left behind. My family's empire loomed in the back of my mind, a monster I had grown up with but had not yet slain. I knew they were still out there, still profiting from misery, still silencing anyone who dared oppose them. I couldn't face them head-on, not yet. I wasn't ready, and neither was the case I was slowly piecing together. But I could prepare. So while my fellow marshals drank off stress at bars or went home to their families, I spent my nights gathering threads. Quietly, carefully, I began looking into my family from the inside. Financial transactions, property records, business licenses, anything I could access legally, I collected. It wasn't much at first, but it was something. Living that double, life was suffocating. To my colleagues, I was a tough but private marshal who rarely talked about her family. To my relatives, I was the dropout no one needed to take seriously. I had to maintain the lie at every family gathering, every phone call, every accidental encounter. I listened to them mock me, insult me, pity me, and I smiled through it. They never suspected the real reason for my silence. The danger of discovery was constant. If they had even the faintest idea of what I was doing, my life would have been over. And yet, the higher the risk, the sharper my determination became. I reminded myself of the victims I had seen on the job. Children caught in gang crossfire, women trapped in trafficking rings, families destroyed by drugs. My family was fueling that same cycle, maybe not directly in every case, but enough to stain their hands with blood. And I couldn't allow it to continue. There were nights I nearly broke under the weight of it all. Nights when exhaustion pressed on me so hard I could barely breathe, when loneliness hollowed me out, when the urge to walk away nearly won. No one knew the burden I carried. I couldn't tell my colleagues the truth. I couldn't confide in friends. I bore it alone, clinging to the belief that one day it would all be worth it. And then came the first turning point. A fugitive case brought me face to face with someone who had once worked under my family's network. He didn't recognize me. I was just another marshal hauling him in. But as he spilled information in exchange for protection, my blood ran cold. He described routes, payments, names I knew all too well. My family's fingerprints were everywhere. That was the moment. I realized I wasn't just gathering scraps anymore. I had found the first crack in the wall. From then on, I dedicated myself to the long game. Every case I worked, I watched for connections. Every name, every address, every phone number. If it brushed against my family's empire, I stored it away. Slowly, the pieces formed a web. One eye alone could see clearly. But the deeper I dug, the more dangerous it became. On more than one occasion, I caught hints that my family was aware someone was watching them. Associates grew paranoid. Meetings were shifted. Codes changed. I had to tread carefully, never too close, never too obvious. Because if they ever suspected that the dropout was the one closing in, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate me. Through all of this, the whispers never stopped. At weddings, they pitied me for not having a husband. At birthdays, they mocked me for not bringing children. At funerals, they shook their heads and whispered about the daughter who couldn't keep her life together. And I smiled, nodded, played my role as the failure. They thought they were humiliating me, but every word only hardened my resolve. Years blurred into decades. My badge grew heavier with responsibility, my record longer with successes. And in the shadows, my case against them grew thicker, stronger, undeniable. 23 years of dual existence, of silent suffering, of relentless pursuit, all leading to the day when I would finally reveal the truth. But the truth had a cost. The deeper I went, the more I realized that destroying them would mean severing myself from family completely. Blood or not, once I took the stand, there would be no going back. I would never again be the niece, the cousin, the daughter. I would be the enemy, and I accepted that, because by then I had long since stopped. Seeing them as family, they weren't my family, they were my target. The courtroom was a theater of silence and spectacle, and I was the unexpected star. By the time I returned for the second day of testimony, the air inside felt charged, restless, like a storm waiting to break. My family sat in their row, polished, and composed on the surface, but I could see it. The twitch of my uncle's jaw, the way my aunt clenched her pearls too tightly, the nervous shuffle of my cousins who had always been so smug. Their empire was crumbling, and they knew it. The prosecutor wasted no time. He called for additional exhibits, each one a hammer striking at the image my family had built. Bank records, phone logs, hidden surveillance recordings. And then, once again, I was summoned to the stand. The weight of every eye in that room pressed down on me as I swore in again. But this time I felt stronger. I had told part of the story already. Now it was time to reveal the rest. I spoke of how money moved in circles so elaborate that only years of digging had unraveled them. I detailed meetings where bribes were exchanged under the table of legitimate businesses. I explained how charitable foundations raised funds that never reached a single cause. The jury listened, heads nodding slowly as the puzzle pieces came together. But what truly broke the courtroom's composure were the stories. Not just numbers and accounts, but faces and lives. I told them about the family in Ohio whose restaurant was burned down after refusing to pay protection money. I told them about the teenage girl funneled through trafficking routes disguised as employment opportunities. I told them about the overdoses that spiked whenever a new shipment hit the streets, drugs that had passed through my family's hands. Every word cut deeper than the last, not just into the case, but into the image my family had built around themselves. For years, they had pretended to be pillars of the community, donors, leaders, benefactors. Now, in front of a federal jury, they were stripped bare as predators. Their attorneys scrambled to object, but the prosecutor was ready. Every claim I made had documents, witnesses, and evidence to back it. My testimony wasn't just words. It was the culmination of decades of preparation. And the jury could feel it. The longer I spoke, the more the cracks showed. My uncle, once so composed, slammed his hand on the table in frustration, earning a sharp reprimand from the judge. My aunt whispered furiously into her lawyer's ear, her mask of elegance slipping with every passing minute. My cousins exchanged panicked glances, realizing that their futures were unraveling in real time. And then, the mask shattered. One of my cousins, always the most arrogant of them all, lost control. He leapt from his seat, shouting across the courtroom that I was a liar, a traitor, a disgrace. His voice echoed off the walls, raw and venomous. The judge's gavel slammed down, demanding order, but in that moment, the illusion of control was gone. The jury saw them for what they truly were: not respectable citizens under attack, but desperate criminals fighting to keep their empire alive. I sat calmly, watching it unfold. Inside, my heart pounded with a mix of adrenaline and vindication. For years, they had mocked me, belittled me, dismissed me, and now, in front of the world, they revealed their true nature without me having to lift a finger. Their arrogance was their undoing. When order was finally restored, the judge's glare heavy on my cousin. The silence that followed was different. The room no longer doubted who I was or what I had brought before them. The lies my family had spread about me, the dropout, the addict, the failure, were powerless against the truth that stood in front of them. As the hours passed, I continued my testimony, piece by piece dismantling the empire they had spent decades building. But even as I spoke, I could feel the weight of it pressing on me. This wasn't just justice. It was betrayal. A betrayal of blood, of roots, of the very bonds that were supposed to define me. And yet, I felt no regret. Because blood had never stopped them from destroying lives. Blood had never stopped them from profiting off misery. Blood had never stopped them from turning on me when I refused to play their game. So why should blood stop me from ending them? By the time the court recessed that day, the trial was no longer just about evidence. It was about perception. And perception was a battle they were losing. Outside, Reporters swarmed. Headlines already spread like wildfire. Family empire exposed by their own. Cameras flashed as I walked through the courthouse steps, U.S. Marshals flanking me for protection. Questions flew from every direction. How did I hide it for so long? What drove me to turn against my family? Did I fear for my life? I didn't. Answer: I didn't need to. My testimony spoke louder than any soundbite ever could. Back inside the courthouse, I caught a final glimpse of them as they were escorted away for the evening. Their eyes burned into me, filled with hatred and betrayal. To them, I was worse than an enemy. I was family, and I had chosen to destroy them. But the truth was simpler. I hadn't destroyed them. They had destroyed themselves. I had only pulled back the curtain, and the curtain was only beginning to rise. The courthouse emptied each evening, but the war never stopped. Outside the walls of justice, I knew my family was plotting. They had built their lives on intimidation and violence, and they wouldn't accept defeat quietly. Even stripped of their power, their arrogance burned like a torch. The night after my second testimony, I received word from the Marshal's detail assigned to me. Chatter had surfaced, whispers of bounties placed on my head. Associates loyal to my family, men and women who owed them their livelihoods, were being offered rewards for silencing me. It was confirmation of everything I already knew. The courtroom might have been my battlefield, but outside it, survival was still a daily fight. Yet instead of fear, I felt clarity. For 23 years, I had lived in shadows, bearing a secret so heavy it nearly broke me. Now everything was out in the open. The threats only reinforced that I had struck where it hurt most. My family's empire wasn't just falling. It was collapsing with fury, desperate to claw back what it could. Inside the courtroom, the pressure mounted. Each day, new evidence surfaced, each witness another nail in their coffin. The prosecutor painted the empire in vivid detail, and my testimony stitched it all together. The jury wasn't just listening anymore. They were seeing the full scope of the devastation. But with every victory, the emotional toll deepened. I couldn't ignore the weight of what I had done. These were the people who had raised me, who had shared meals with me, who had celebrated holidays under the same roof. For years, I had looked into their eyes and pretended I was blind to the truth. Now those same eyes glared at me with venom from across the courtroom. One moment haunted me most. My aunt, once the image of elegance, broke during recess. She didn't shout like my cousin or pound the table like my uncle. Instead, she sat there, staring at me, her eyes glassy, whispering words I couldn't hear. I knew she was cursing me, but it was the brokenness in her face that cut deeper than any insult. It reminded me that revenge always carries a cost, not just for those who fall, but for the one who strikes. Still, I didn't waver. I reminded myself why I was there. The families torn apart by extortion, the young lives destroyed by drugs, the voices silenced by fear. For them, I couldn't falter. Justice was larger than blood. The media frenzy grew with every passing day. Dropout turned U.S. Marshal. Family betrayal shocks nation. Empire crushed from within. Reporters dissected every piece of my testimony. Pundits debated whether family loyalty should outweigh justice, and the public devoured every headline. My name, once spoken only in whispers of shame within my family, now rang across the country as a symbol of betrayal and resilience, and my family hated it. There, lawyers fought harder, tearing into every detail, trying to twist my past into a weapon. They painted me as vengeful, unstable, bitter. They repeated the old rumors: drug abuse, failure, disgrace. They tried to resurrect the lie they had buried me under decades ago, but it was too late. The evidence stood taller than their words, and the truth was undeniable. The more they attacked me, the smaller they looked in the eyes of the jury. Their desperation bled through every argument. Outside the courthouse, the danger pressed closer. A car followed me once, its headlights fixed on my rearview mirror for miles until the marshal's escort forced it away. Another time, a stranger lingered too long outside the hotel where I was kept under protection. Every incident was a reminder. Though my family sat in chains of law, their influence stretched far, and the battle wasn't done. But perhaps the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was the loneliness. At night, in the silence of my safe house, I thought of what could never be repaired. Holidays would never again hold the same meaning. I would never walk into a family reunion, never hear my name spoken with affection by those who had once claimed me. Even if they had betrayed me first, even if they had painted me as worthless, the severing of blood ties left an emptiness that justice couldn't fill. And yet, when I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of those my family had hurt, the victims who never had a chance to fight back, the ones who had died while my relatives counted profits, the children who had grown up fatherless because of debts unpaid. And I knew then that my revenge wasn't personal anymore. It was bigger. It was about giving those silent voices a chance to finally be heard. The trial neared its end. Closing arguments loomed. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, tension dripping from every corner. And through it all, my family sat across from me, broken but unbowed, glaring with a hatred so sharp it could cut glass. I had destroyed their empire. That much was certain. But I also knew something else. Revenge didn't end in a courtroom. The verdict was coming, and whatever it would be, I was ready. The final day of trial arrived heavy with anticipation. Reporters filled the benches, cameras lined the sidewalks outside, and the nation watched as the jury filed in with solemn faces. For weeks, the courtroom had been a stage where my family's empire was dismantled piece by piece. Now it was time for judgment. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, my badge hidden beneath my jacket. My heart pounded steadily, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. Across from me, my family sat in silence. My uncle's arrogance had drained into a hollow stare. My aunt's elegance was replaced by a tired slump. My cousins, once so smug, looked years older, shadows etched deep into their faces. The judge called for order. The jury foreman rose. The first words, spoken, were like thunder rolling through the room. Guilty. One after another, the charges were read aloud. Racketeering, guilty. Money laundering, guilty. Conspiracy, guilty. Human trafficking, guilty. Extortion, guilty. Each verdict was a nail hammered into the coffin of their empire. The gavel struck, finalizing the judgment. The courtroom erupted, gasps, murmurs, the rapid scratching of pens. But for me, there was only silence. It was over. For 23 years, I had carried the weight of their crimes, the burden of their lies, the sting of their insults. For 23 years, I had been the failure in their story. And now, before the eyes of the world, the truth was laid bare. The dropout had not only survived, but had risen higher than they could ever imagine. As marshals moved to escort them away, I met their eyes one last time. My uncle glared at me, hatred burning like fire. My aunt looked broken, her lips trembling with words unsaid. My cousins sneered through clenched jaws, but there was no power left in them. Only anger. Only fear. And in that moment, I realized something profound. My revenge hadn't been destroying them. That was inevitable. They had built their empire on sand, and it was always going to fall. No, the true revenge had been living, thriving, and becoming everything they said I couldn't be. They called me weak. I became strong. They called me useless. I became essential. They called me a dropout. I became a U.S. Marshal. And now, while they faced decades behind bars, I walked out free, not just free from their control, but free from the chains of their lies. The press swarmed outside, microphones and cameras shoved toward me. Questions flew in the air like arrows. Do you regret testifying against your family? How did you keep the secret for so long? What do you want to say to them now? I didn't answer. My silence was louder than any words could ever be. I didn't need to explain myself to the world. I had already explained myself where it mattered most, in the courtroom, under oath, in the face of those who had tried to bury me. As I stepped into the car that would take me away, I looked back at the courthouse. The building loomed tall, solid, unyielding, a monument to justice, and for the first time in my life, I felt unshackled. Justice wasn't about blood. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about closure. It was about truth. And the truth was that I had survived the very people who had once tried to erase me. They would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, their empire in ruins, their legacy stained forever. And I, Jasmine, the so-called failure, would continue to live, to serve, to protect the very people they had once preyed upon. The greatest revenge was not their destruction. The greatest revenge was me. Me standing, me thriving, me becoming everything they said I couldn't be. And for the first time, I smiled, not because I had won, but because I was finally free.